Hello. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about the Battle of Nomonhan, or the Battle of Khalkin Gol, as called by the Soviets. And this is a border clash between the Soviet Union and the Japanese Empire in 1939. But first, I will go over things that led up to this incident. So there's a number of events that are really important in the discussion of going towards the Battle of Nomonhan. And one of the big events that we'll go to is the Battle of Chinkufeng, and that should probably be the third episode on this series. This is going to be a series that talks about all those events. In this episode, we're going to be pretty much talking about everything up to around 1937 or 1938, depends on how much time I have. And um, the next episode after this should be all the time between then and maybe up to 1938 or 39. And then actually up to 1938. And then maybe the third episode will be about the Battle of Chinkufeng, which is actually a really big incident going up to the Battle of Nomonhan. And then after that, there may be an episode 4 about events in between, and then an episode 5 and an episode 6. I might designate 2 episodes to talk about Nomonhan itself, because that's the focus of this series. So really, this series should be called um, Japanese-Soviet relations, Japanese-Soviet border clashes in the late 1930s. And today, we're not going to be talking about the late 1930s at all. We'll be going over the lead up towards this. And there's actually a lot of events that lead up towards the Khalkin Gol incident. So first, um, I'll discuss maybe late 19th century China, Japan, and the Soviet Union, or Russian Empire. So um, Japan, after a Meiji Restoration, um, was united, but it didn't have outward influence. It didn't have Korea yet, and didn't have Taiwan yet. It was just stuck to the home islands, and Japan would start to become more and more aggressive over the years, and they tried to take more land. So the first part of the story, I guess, might be the first Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s, in which the Japanese win. They forced Korea to become basically independent, because as before it was a Chinese tributary of the Qing dynasty, and afterwards Japan removed Korea from the Chinese sphere of influence. But then during this time, the Qing dynasty is um, it's a long ruling empire, but it's on the brink of collapse. At any moment, it could collapse because it underwent so many rebellions and revolutions from Taiping, Boxer, um, so many revolts, so many wars with foreign countries as well. So eventually, what's important to the story is the Qing dynasty would lose this eastern territory to the Russian Empire, known as the Maritime Province, so Russians will call it. And um, that's basically off the coastline going up through eastern Manchuria down to the port of Vladivostok, which is very important for the Russians. But Russia also has interest in the region of Manchuria. And keep in mind, the Qing dynasty, um, well, they come from Manchuria. And the Russians want to take control of the railways in Manchuria, and Japan wants more control over the East China Sea area. So um, Japan takes control over Formosa, Taiwan, and they start to advance and take a lot of islands in the Pacific. Now, a big moment for the Japanese was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. So Japan and Russia went to war, and Japan is an emerging power. Russia is a retaining power. They are already viewed as very powerful. They took down Napoleon. They're very powerful. But what happens is that Japan is able to win against the Russians. The Russians um, lose in the Battle of Tsushima, and as a result, when President Theodore Roosevelt um, makes them sign the Treaty of Portsmouth, the two countries agree that one, Russia will not um, will not want to have influence in Manchuria. Two, they will withdraw from Port Arthur, which is Dalian, and that will go to Japan. And three, that Russia would cede South Sakhalin to Japan. So Japan got the southern part of that island, and another event that happened a few years later is when Japan will continue to advance, they'd annex Korea. Now Korea sits in an awkward geographic location where they're exactly between all of the Russian, Japanese, and Chinese interests. So if you remember, during the first Sino-Japanese War, Korea lost its status as a Chinese vassal or a tributary, and now in 1910, the Japanese conquer Korea, and then this expansion will continue, and Japan would lose its primary um, rival in East Asia, the Qing dynasty, when during the Qinghai Rebellion of 1911 to 1912, the Qing dynasty collapses. The Qing dynasty collapses and they turn into a bunch of several different states, different warlords, and they become very disunited. And Japan takes advantage of this and they understand it's time to um, expand. And another great opportunity arises in 1914. 1914 was when Russia and France and the UK went to war against Germany and Austria Hungary. So all of Europe is at war. Um, and this means that Russia can reduce its influence in the Far East, and even the colony holding powers of France and the UK reduce influence, and they simply care less about Asia. They focus mostly on Europe because they need to muster all their strength to win the war in the Western Front. And Japan, at this point, um, uh, has no very powerful rival in the area. China is in ruin. Um, and in 1917, Russia goes through two revolutions, and the second one overthrows the old government and becomes Bolshevik, and thus weaker. And Russian Civil War ignites, and the White Army and the Red Army just fight against each other. And Japan, of course, supports the Whites, and this leads to um, a, an increase in Japanese influence in East Asia and Siberia, because during this time Japan occupies the railways, the Chinese Eastern Railway, um, as well as Vladivostok and much of the maritime province. They send in 60 to 70,000 forces to the area, much more than the Americans or the British even really send in this area. And eventually, however, Japan is forced to give back that territory because the communists win the Civil War, and it doesn't make sense for Japan to hold on to it, or otherwise there would be a state of war between Japan and Russia. And since they don't want that, they have to withdraw from all Russian territory. So uh, Japan ends up sharing two borders with the emergent Soviet Union, that being the border between North and South Sakhalin and the border between Korea and the maritime province of Russia. Um, so Japan at this point hasn't expanded into China other than Port Arthur. They have the Liaotung lease, um, and they have Korea and they have Formosa. That's all that Japan has. Um, Although during the Treaty of Versailles, Japan would also acquire some German islands, some Pacific islands like Saipan and in the area. The volcano islands are also end up being on in Japanese hands. So during the 1920s, uh, Japan is in a very strong situation. They emerge as one of the most powerful countries in the world. Say the fifth or sixth most powerful country in the world, because they became victorious at the end of the war, and Japan ends up with no serious um, powerful rival in the area close to Japan, other than maybe the United States, but they're very far away, and under Taft administration, um, they decided not to care about Japan's interest in East Asia, as long as the Americans were able to hold on to the Philippines, of course. And the first uh, and then the Soviet Union is an interesting story, because their civil war ends in 1923 when it completely ends, and a really important event what happened in 1924. That's Lenin's death, and when their first leader Lenin dies and Stalin takes over, well, it actually takes some time for Stalin to really muster all of his power and to consolidate his rule. But eventually, in a few years, he does. In 1928, the biggest action that he takes is the first 5 year plan, and that's an economic plan that's designed to really advance Russia down from up from this uh, almost third world country to a more developed industrialized country like the rest of Europe is. Um, and before then, all of the revolution and all this war had really hurt Russia and the economy. Peasants were starving. There was a Holodomor, which so many Ukrainian farmers starved to death. And it wasn't limited in Ukraine. The starving happened in rural Caucasus, rural Western Russia, rural Volga area. Everywhere, people were starving in the Soviet Union. So they want to focus on the economy and growing it by working hard. But one thing that did was that meant that the Soviet Union had to reduce its military output. So it would spend less on its military and spend more on just industry to build more factories and build more machinery in order to export more. Um, and also, some food would also be exported um, externally. And even if that meant that some of the civilians in Russia would starve to death, they really wanted to export a lot in order to bring the economy up. And this was actually somewhat of a success, because by 1932, when Stalin called an end to the first 5 year plan, uh, historians admit, whether they're pro Stalinization or not, that um, this form of Stalinist collectivization and focus on industry did produce some effect. And in truth, the Soviets were able to really expand their industry, and they grew a substantial amount, albeit with immense civilian cost. So by 1932, the Soviets have grown from a totally backward country to a somewhat backwards country. Now let's see what's happening with the other power that we're going to be talking about in the Russian-Japanese relations, which is Japan. So what happens in Japan between the 1920s towards the early 1930s? Well, first, Japan is somewhat in good shape. They prosper, they grow. They sign the Washington Naval Treaty, which give a 553 naval ratio among the ships. That being Japan is the 3, Britain and the U.S. are the 5, and France and Italy both get 1 1/4. But Japan keeps militarizing. They expand, and they do end up um, growing as a country until one important event, 1927. Um, and there'll be a financial crisis in 1927, and this is because up until that point, Japan had been this really capitalistic state, almost comparable to like the Gilded Age of America in some ways. Uh, Not exact, but Japan would have all these giant um, mega corporations um, like Mitsubishi and Mitsui, and they have so much control over everyday life. And Japan would uh, would suffer through a banking crisis in 1927, which was limited to its own country. That's because of just a bank failure, a bank run. But they were able to recuperate it, um, and eventually they went back on track um, to where they wanted to be. But in 1929, they would suffer through something very similar, but much bigger and worldwide. The Great Depression in 1929 hits, and Japan is no exception to the um, global catastrophe uh, of economics, and Japan would suffer as well uh, the financial burden of the Great Depression. So their economy went down and up in 1927. They will go down again in 1929. But they would slowly try to be able to um, regain some of that economic loss. Um, and and actually that really started in 1930. The Wall Street crash was in 29, but really it was in 1930 that that begun again. And that was just as they managed to recuperate after a couple years of financial burden. They had to face another depression, an even larger depression. Uh, and they had so little resources inside Japan that Japan needed to import a lot of things like food and grain from places like Manchuria and the United States in order to keep their economy afloat. So they had to reduce military focus. However, there'd always be people focusing on military, of course, within the government. Um, and this was um, pretty clodomistic uh, for for the Showa government and um, the uh, the Hamaguchi government. Um, but after that, in around 1932, around the same time that the Soviets finished their 5 year plan, the first 5 year plan, the Japanese are able to recuperate. So by that year, both countries are in a better shape than they were before, although they both had their issues. And beginning in 1939 is a very interesting time because exactly a month after the Soviets, after Stalin calls his 5 year plan done, Germany undergoes a massive political change. And you know what it is. January 1933, and Hitler becomes elected as chancellor. Um, and what that does to the Soviets is that it it makes them realize that, wait, this is a different type of capitalist. You know, to Stalin, he wants as much as possible for capitalist powers to fight against each other. That's his goal, and he believes that National Socialist Germany is capitalist and Britain and France are capitalist, but they don't like each other, and that they can fight against each other. And if the Soviets play their cards right, he can make the fascists in, like, Mussolini already had control over Italy for a decade, and um, the fascists and the democracies in Western Europe would eventually fight one day. So that was his goal, in order to make those two groups fight against each other. But it doesn't exactly go to exactly what he wants. Another, yeah, um, yeah, I'll probably talk about. Um, so the Soviet government, um, yeah, as I was saying, the Soviet government is in favor of making Germany and France and Britain fight against each other. But this somewhat doesn't work. Um, and that was exemplified in the um, policy of appeasement that both Britain and France really followed, especially Neville Chamberlain. And Britain and France decided not to intervene in all of the Nazi aggressions. They were breaking so many parts of the treaties of Versailles. They were militarizing, they were making tanks, making planes. And eventually they militarized Rhineland in 36, and they still did nothing. No visible response. Uh, and this continued on in 1936, 1937. Um, and Britain, France did nothing. However, uh, it was really in 1938 when the Soviets would really start to get mad. Um, because in 1938, uh, Germany annexes Austria. And okay, that's a little more forgivable because, you know, although they are taking new land, Rhineland isn't new land, it was always a part of Germany, just a demilitarized area. But Austria's new land, it was never a part of Germany, and Nazi Germany is annexing Austria. Britain and France do nothing about it. So the Soviets start to wonder a little bit. Are they really going to do nothing no matter what Germany does? Because if that's the case, then, contrary to what Stalin wants, Germany and the Soviet Union might end up having to fight. And that's not what Stalin wants at all. So he wants to prevent that to the best of his possibility. And although in March Germany annexes Austria, in September Germany annexes the Sudetenland through the Munich Agreement, and that really, really infuriates Stalin because Germany and Italy and Britain and France agree, they write a paper and they sign, they just agree to let Germany take over probably the most important area, most important military area in Czechoslovakia. And Britain and France do absolutely nothing about it. So that you can understand how that reasonably infuriates Stalin. However, what is happening on the other side of the world in Japan and uh in Russia? Well, Russia had this history of their okay. Let's talk about their armed forces a little bit because their government after the Meiji Restoration, it's just been they had an emperor, so it was an empire, technically speaking, uh, and effectively as well because they had numerous territories. But they were also somewhat democratic. They had a parliament, um, they had a diet, um, and they had all these different ministers, and these ministers were at least officially directly under the emperor, but really they were just under the prime minister of the Japanese Empire. Um, and they went through numerous different prime ministers, but emperors, it was just after Meiji was Meiji, Taisho, and Showa, which is Hirohito. And Hirohito takes power in sometime in the uh, 1920s, I believe. And um, he's much more like relaxed. Um, but he's also just an emperor, and although officially he's supposed to be the one with the most power in the country, realistically he has no political power at all. Um, all the political power is in the hands of the actual politicians, like the prime minister. So that's Japan's politics. How about Japan's military? And Japan has a rich military history. Um, but during the 1930s, um, Japan had developed from this old, 19th century system of samurai warriors and stuff towards this more modern army and more modern navy. And there was a strong rivalry between the IJA, the army, and the IJN, the navy, during this time. And there was also this ideal of um, Gekokujo, especially in the army, which basically meant that middle class officers, and middle class I mean like middle ranking officers, had the ability or the authority to make their own decisions and become independent and make decisions on behalf of the larger government. So um, it was an institutionalized uh, concept of insubordination in a way, if you look at it. And and that was in the army and navy. Now the army was still mostly infantry, um, though they had developed from sorts to using guns, so to use rifles, um, and the Japanese army, um, is now more inclusive in terms of class. So before they were very exclusive. Only people like the samurai class were able uh, to to hold these weapons and serve. But during the 1930s, more peasants would be allowed to join the army, and the navy acted in a similar way. Now, there were two big naval agreements that I will need to discuss. They're really important as background um, towards Japanese relations with other countries. And I'll go over them very briefly because they're not in direct relation towards Japan Soviet Union. So there's a Washington Naval Treaty 1922, and essentially, uh, five great powers in the world agree upon a naval limit, uh, not including submarines, and they all agree on a certain ratio of tonnage of ships, uh, especially capitalist ships, in which they can make. So for every five ships, actually let's multiply by two so it'll make sense. For every 10 ships the Americans make, Britain can also make 10. Japan can make 6. Okay? Britain can make 10, American can make 10, and Japan can make 6. And that was called the 553 ratio. And they agreed upon this, and this was accepted. However, in 1930, they revised that in the London Naval Treaty. The London Naval Treaty um, was basically the same idea, but it contained only three powers. They left out Italy and France, and it was slightly different. It'll be a 10-10-7 ratio. 10 ships for Britain, 10 ships for the US, and 3 ships, and 7 ships for the Japanese. So that was an improvement. They really pushed for that. So Japan was on no way at the same level militarily as the UK or the US, but they were growing. They were a rising power during the interwar period. Um, and and so the Navy liked this. Um, the uh, the Army, um, yeah, the Army didn't have much action during this time period. They didn't really go into China or Russia at all. They were pretty much remaining in Japan, and some of them were really anxious to advance and go to somewhere else. Uh, and um, and at this time, like the armed forces of Japan, um, like as I said, it was mostly infantry. They had no sizable air force at that time, and there was no large amount of cavalry. They were developing artillery. So they had artillery, um, very limited cavalry, as far as I know, and no tanks. The Japanese wouldn't develop tanks yet, um, and the officers would be trained in a not so atypical way, not too unusual. They had a military college. They had an army. Um, I believe it's called like the National Military Academy, where first students would go and they'd learn all these tactics, um, and they would at first in that level learn all of the tactics. They learn how to actually serve on the battlefield as a lieutenant, as a captain, as a major, um, as a lieutenant general, and then after that, um, like say 6,000 a year would go through that college, and then after that they would select like the best 600 every year to go to the national like army college, and the national army um, college, I believe it's called just the national war college of the army or something like that, and they'll be more selective. Around the top 10% would be legible for that education, and that is for people who are deemed to be more successful and could hold on to higher positions along the Japanese chain of command. So that's how they were able to train better officers. But those officers at the top, they were trained to think more broadly and generally, as in larger areas of command. Like if they were to command an entire army, what would you do? But they also were taught, pretty importantly, uh, they were taught some like more ideas of just believing in yourself, and despite numerical disadvantages, the idea of always being able to win. Um, Very religion like beliefs, I would say. And those were propagated in the um, the Army War College. Um, and eventually, after the Great Depression hits Japan, in 1931, this will come to show as the IJA is very anxious. They're very anxious to start some incident, and uh, and this is started by a group of officers in this army known as the Kwantung Army. So you had the Chosun Army, which controlled the area of former Joseon Dynasty, which is Korea, But then there's Kwantung. Kwantung is basically the like the area where Port Arthur is, um, the Liaotung Peninsula, and that's also called the Kwantung Peninsula in Japanese. And Kwantung Army staged an uh, operation so that they could create some sort of incident to make an excuse to invade Manchuria. This was known as a Mukden incident. This happened in 1931, and in 1931, Japan decided to just attack. Why? Because there was an incident, and they were able to use that to make a claim that uh, they'd be able to, you know, invade Manchuria. And so they invade Manchuria. Um, and that went up for a few months and ended, I think, around February in 1932. And what that meant was that not only did Japan attain a very valuable area, um, with tons of food resources and ton of land, but they'd also share a much longer border with the Soviet Union. But the Japanese got Manchuria, giant chunk out of China, just like that. Uh, and this is um yeah, this was a major event for the Japanese, turning point for the army. And the Kwantung Army was never really severely punished for making up this incident. Of course, the Japanese government um, was not all that happy that they had these unruly officers in one organized army that caused invasion. But no, it wasn't a bad war. They won, and they got some disdain from the rest of the world, including the League of Nations. But they acquired a very important asset. And before I end, another quite significant event that would be happening during this time is in China. Um, and going up to around 1933, I go maybe. Um, and that is uh, the Chinese Civil War. So China would be going through a crisis for like decades. Um, Japan, uh, J- or China, was split up between several different warlords after the collapse of Qing Dynasty, but one group would become the most powerful, and that was the Kuomintang clique, uh, and it also was known as the Republic of China, and it was led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. And this group tried to unify all of China. They weren't absolutely successful. But they were successful in maintaining a large portion of China under their control. And one notable um, group that did not follow suit with the nationalists was the communists. So there was this fight between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek's forces, um, and eventually the nationalists would be so powerful they control over much longer area, bigger area, and they'd force eventually in like 1935, they'd force the communist Chinese to do perform what is now known as the Long March, in which the nationalists chased the communists all around China, from like Hunan to like I think they went all the way to Gansu or to Shaanxi. I think is where they ended up, somewhere in north central China. But then they eventually called it off. So that's where I'll leave this episode. I think maybe I went a little too far in terms of European affairs, but uh, the Soviet Union um, became a growing economic power, Japan as well. Japanese military was growing, both the army and the navy. The army invaded Manchuria, and the navy was allowed to expand um, to 70% of the American naval force. And China had this whole civil war, and it was not ending. It did not end yet. But the nationalists were able to become a dominant powerhouse in that area. So that's where I'll end it for now. Japanese Soviet relations were not good because Japan had interfered against the communists for the White Army, remember, during the Russian Civil War. And although there were no border incidents during this time, Japan and the Soviet Union did not have the best of relations. So I'll leave it at that. So a few weeks later, when I might have forgotten this topic, I will record a second episode regarding uh, next part of the lead up to Nomonhan, maybe going up from like 1934 or so to 1938. So that's what I'll do. All right, thank you very much for listening. Um, and I might record the next part in several weeks, probably in April. Yep. So see you in April.